reads Matthew. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, Mark says, and as we just heard, on the first day of the week at early dawn, they came to the tomb. When it comes to the resurrection of Christ, all of the Gospels are different in the way that they tell the story, but all of them agree about one thing. Whatever happened that day, whatever those women experienced at the empty tomb, it had something to do with mourning and with the dawning of light. I don't know if the night has ever overflowed in your life. I don't know if you've ever been in a time when you felt lost or uncertain about the future or even full of despair and unable to see the way ahead of you. I know I have been there. There have been times in my life when my only prayer was, "Oh God, make a way where there is no way." So maybe you know what I'm talking about, or maybe you are in such a time right now. If so, know that you are not alone. In a way, all of us are right there with you. We live in a time when the future seems terribly uncertain in all kinds of ways. When I was young, I had the false impression that the future would be more or less an upward arc of progress and growing awareness. And in the long run, I still believe it is. I still believe, more than ever really, that the universe bends toward goodness and justice in the long run, but in the short run, it's much harder to see. Life and history are much more up and down than that. Sometimes it seems down and down. So if you're in such a place right now, or if you've ever been in such a place in your life, then you know how the friends and followers of Jesus felt after the crucifixion and before the mourning. They felt lost, uncertain about the future, full of despair, and unable to see the way ahead. Some of them ran away, some hid in fear, some fell back on the routines of daily life and practice. The women, at least, had the courage to confront the death of Jesus by caring for his body in the traditional way, preparing spices and fragrant oil and going to the tomb to anoint his body the day after the Sabbath. It was the only thing they knew to do in the midst of their loss and grief. They did what was expected of them, and when you are grieving, that's sometimes the hardest thing of all to do. But when they got to the tomb, doing what was expected of them, they found something completely unexpected, something they couldn't have dreamed before that morning. Something so unimaginable to them that they fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, according to the Gospel of Mark. Terror and amazement. You see, the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back, and Jesus wasn't there. The powers of death had not held him. The power of life had prevailed. But at first, their minds just couldn't grasp it. A similar pattern takes place in the resurrection story in the Gospel of John, where Mary Magdalene stands weeping outside the empty tomb. The risen Christ greets her, as we just heard, but at first, she too cannot grasp, cannot imagine that it's him. I mean, and who can blame her? She turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she didn't know it was Jesus. She thought it was the gardener. She said, "If you've carried him away, tell me where you've laid him." It's only when she hears the sound of his voice calling her name that she recognizes him and becomes the first witness to the resurrection. "I have seen the Lord," she announced to the disciples. "I have seen the Lord." Of course, their minds were no more ready to grasp the possibility of resurrection than hers. In fact, in the Gospel of Luke, it tells us that when the women told the disciples what they experienced at the tomb, these words seemed to them like an idle tale, and they did not believe them. Other translations put it this way: the apostles thought it was all nonsense, and they would not believe. Their report seemed to them like idle talk and nonsense, and they would not believe them. The apostles thought that what the women said was nonsense, and they didn't believe them. These reports seemed to the men an idle tale, madness, and they didn't believe the women.